So in this bonus material, I want to talk a little bit about one of the pioneers in applying scientific methods to the study of religious history, to historical texts and historical phenomenon, David Sloan Wilson, who's not as well known, I think, in the cognitive science of religion, coming from a biological background. So Wilson, most people who know about Wilson know him as one of the person who basically single-handedly rehabilitated group selection as a scientific concept, I think. The idea of group selections, the idea that evolution could function with groups as the units, was an idea that floated around a lot in the early 20th century. A lot of the ideas about group selection were very naive. They just weren't scientifically, biologically well grounded. So these ideas of kind of individuals sacrificing themselves for the good of the species, as if species were units of selection, or even individuals were units of selection. These ideas were really demolished in the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And I think the best representation of this synthesis is Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, which summarized work and really synthesized it and put it together with some powerful metaphors in a way that made it make sense to people in a way that it never had before. It was the insight that actually evolution's happening at the level of the genes. It's not about the survival of the species. It's not even really about the individual. It's about genes getting copies of themselves into the next generation. And this was an incredibly powerful insight and actually explained what's really going on in things that seem like individuals sacrificing themselves for the family or the group. So if you see a parent sacrificing themselves for their offspring, it seems like an altruistic, self-sacrificial act, but what's going on, they argued, and this seems to be the case, is that this is working because of gene-level selection. It's called kin selection. So the copies of the genes in this organism are also present in their offspring, and under certain conditions, it makes sense for these genes to design their container, essentially the organism that's carrying them around, to behave in a way that enhances the offspring's survival and not theirs. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the individual, certainly not about the species, it's about the genes. And so this has been an incredibly powerful insight. It's explained cooperation throughout the animal world. What's happened along with it, though, was a kind of discrediting, because these older group accounts were based on these kind of fuzzy ideas about how evolution worked. The idea of group selection itself became kind of labeled as unscientific. And I think there was really developed this kind of prejudice about group selection. So David Sloan Wilson really was a lone voice in the wilderness saying, fine, the mechanism is happening at the level of the genes, but there's no reason in principle why the conditions couldn't create situations where those genes are getting bundled into different level units, different size units. You could imagine conditions where genes would be put into a group together in the same boat, where it would look like, and effectively you'd have selection going on at another level. And he showed a lot of examples of this. You get social insect colonies. Essentially, you've got multiple organisms that are working together as a kind of single superorganism, and that's the best way for them to collectively get their genes into the next generation. We are basically group selection units. So we have all these cells in our bodies that are collaborating so that just this one sex cell can try to get some of our genes in the next generation. And somatic cells are making sacrifices on this regard because some of their genes are then going to get, through this mechanism, passed on to the next generation. There's no reason in principle why selection, even though the mechanism is this gene reproduction, you couldn't have conditions that created selection at different levels, at group levels. And so I think it's been a long haul. He was a kind of lone voice in the wilderness for a long time. But I think if you want an introduction to just evolution as a general mechanism, this is a fantastic book, Evolution for Everyone, really crystal clear, and really lays out the debate, the grounds of the debate, and why, in principle, we should talk about Darwinian selection happening at multiple levels. It really just depends on what the conditions are. And it's still a heated debate in the field. There is still, I think of them as kind of gene-only fundamentalists. So people like Richard Dawkins or Steve Pinker still dismiss group selection. But I think the general position in the field now is selection can happen on different levels depending on the conditions involved. And most importantly, people are also taking seriously the idea of cultural group selection and cultural evolution. The reason I bring Wilson up in Module 5 is that he was really a pioneer and this idea that we could use tools from biology, particularly evolutionary theory, and apply them to cultural evolution and explaining religion, the history of religion, in a rigorous scientific way. And the model he used and the analogy he used, which became, it's a powerful analogy, I think it's an important one, is that of the relationship of Darwin to pre-Darwinian natural historians. So you have these explorers and naturalists coming back from these expeditions to the New World with all sorts of specimens, so these dead butterflies and birds, and they stuff them and they put them in cases, and they create these collections, but they've got no way to explain what produces this diversity or what principles might be behind patterns in this diversity. There's no way to organize this material. And yet it's data, and so it's these kind of collections that became the data that Darwin used to construct his theory of natural selection. So also his own field work in the Galapagos, but he's using the data of natural historians to create a theory that can then explain what the principles are that generate all the diversity that we see in the natural world. People like David Sloan Wilson said, we can have an analogous situation when we're talking about historical data, historical cultural data. So you've got, and we've talked a little bit about this in Module 1, so the early phases of religious studies, in fact very much inspired by things like the Darwinian Project, had big theories. They had functional theories. And we're looking at the historical record and the ethnographic record with an eye toward coming up with big, powerful theories that would explain the diversity that we see. I mentioned also that this approach really fell out of favor in the 60s, especially 60s and 70s, with a cultural turn where we got allergic to explanation in religious studies and really focused more on thick descriptions. So we're going to collect these. But basically, we became like these natural historians. We're going to collect these butterflies and we're going to put them in cases and we're going to organize them based on color or shape, but we don't want to talk about any theories about why they're shaped differently or why they have different colors. And I think Wilson's great insight was that if we apply evolutionary theory to cultural evolution, we can actually tell some stories about this. We can be like Darwin coming to natural historians and saying, this is how you can organize and understand the connections between the specimens you have, the data that you have. So to his credit, although he wasn't trained as a historian of religion, Wilson tried to put his money where his mouth is and actually show how scientific theories like the theory of evolution can be applied to the history of religion, analyzing why some religions succeeded and others didn't. So he does this in a really important book, 2002 book, Darwin's Cathedral. It's one of the landmarks in the application of science to the study of religion. And he looks at a couple historical case examples. So one that he spends the most time on is Calvinism, so the particular brand of Christianity being advocated by John Calvin in the city of, and he's focusing on the city of Geneva in the 1530s. And his argument is if you look at this novel form of Christianity, it's a new form of Christianity, it has new features, new parts of its belief system. He says you see how these actually seem as if they were designed to serve group-level cultural group functions. And interestingly, I think this is a very clever strategy. He says, well, how do we get a sense of this? Well, let's look at the catechism. So Calvin created, Wilson calls it at one point a cultural genome. He said he created basically, here's what you need to believe to be in the city and be part of my group, a set of beliefs you have to accept. And if you analyze these, Wilson argues, you see it's got certain features, including the sacralization of mundane life, so the idea that as a baker or as a carpenter, you are doing God's will as well. You're part of God's plan as much as a priest is. And so you're part of this bigger order, and therefore you should pay attention to your behavior and how you do that job. Also, the new techniques for policing belief and policing orthodoxy and policing behavior among both the common people and the elite, among the priests as well. And so techniques for stamping out heresy, which some of the stuff from a modern liberal perspective seems old-fashioned. We don't like stamping out heresy anymore, but from a cultural evolutionary perspective, stamping out heresy is very important. You want to get people all together on the same page. And so Wilson argues this became that there's certain features here that you can see as you would predict from a cultural evolutionary perspective they would make groups that embrace these principles more successful. And he argues that this is in fact what you see. So Geneva became very successful as a result of this, and so much so that this model gets exported. So people take it to other places and implement it in other places in Europe. People see how successful Geneva is and they come and imitate it. So through imitation and transmission, this model spreads, and that's the spread of what became known as Calvinism. So the thing we now call Calvinism is this particular innovation that Wilson argues quite convincingly has some cultural evolutionary benefits. So to his credit, he realized that there's an issue with cherry picking here. So he gives a couple other historical examples after this. The Balinese water temple example that we've talked about, the case of Judaism, so certain features of Judaism that he thinks have social group functions, and then interestingly, the early Christian church. So what about certain features of this particular sect of Judaism that became what we now know as Christianity, caused it to be successful and allowed people to bond together in effective ways. But there is this problem. As a good scientist, he's aware that there's this problem of cherry picking. So I have this theory, and then there's a tendency to then go look among the data to find examples that support my theory and ignore the ones that don't. He didn't really have a great solution for this when it comes to the historical record. So he did some work on ethnography and notes that when you're doing ethnography, you can use something like HRAF to get a more objective sense of what the diversity out there is. His solution was to look at the Encyclopedia of Religion. So this was a 16-volume set of encyclopedias documenting religious diversity that was edited by Eliade. And he actually developed a computer program that would allow him to randomly sample from these encyclopedia volumes and get, instead of him deciding what the examples are, he had this computer program decide. So a more objective selection of data that he can then analyze using cultural evolutionary models. So this was really, for the time, no one had been doing anything like this. And this is important. So at one point he says, the problem with the historical record is we don't have anything like HRAF for religions, for the history of religions. This was true in 2002. This is starting to change. And so we've talked in 5.3 about these new database approaches to religion, things like Plot2 and the database of religious history. These can be solutions to this kind of cherry-picking problem, or the problem of getting a decent sample of historical data. So this issue of cherry-picking, the issue of do we have an equivalent of something like HRAF of a database for the history of religion, segues nicely into another bit of bonus material for 5.3, where I'll talk a little bit about the database of religious history, its origins, its motivations, and kind of how the project started and where it sees itself going.